Welcome to everyone. We're so delighted to begin this lecture series. And the reception after this lecture will be over at the Cooper Gallery, where we have the beautiful exhibition of Wole Soyinka's collection. So I hope you can all join us for that. Awam Amka is a curator of visual and performing arts. He recently curated Lines, Motions, and Rituals in New York, Significations in Havana, Cuba, Resignifications in Florence, Italy, and the international traveling exhibition Africa, See You, See Me. Trained as a dramatist, documentary filmmaker, and scholar of theater and film, he teaches drama at New York University's Tisch School of the Arts. I could go on, but it's greatly my pleasure to have worked with Awam to curate our current exhibition. Awam, will you introduce Professor?
Good afternoon. It's such a great pleasure to be here, and I want to thank you, Professor Gates and the Hutchins Center, for giving me the privilege of introducing an extraordinary individual who bridges the worlds of art and action, of spirit and revolution. Dramatist, poet, essayist, musician, philosopher of art, scholar, teacher, mentor, and human rights activist. The speaker is, as your program notes rightfully informs you, is Africa's first Nobel laureate in literature. But he is also a literary star with a difference, one who will arguably leave this world a little different than he found it. For Professor Soyinka, he produces art that shakes up societies and galvanizes ideas of change. He has engaged, created, and dare I say, divined publics through which his theater, sometimes film creations in many different forums, from stately theaters to street corners and public squares across the globe, occur. For the academic, Professor Soyinka has left a monumental legacy of knowledge creation across Africa and the rest of the world. The army of students he has taught and mentored, the legion of teachers who have translated, extended, and developed his ideas testify to this bequest. Charged by the ideas of culture and humanism as perpetual regenerative principles with which society must continue to build and evaluate itself, Professor Soyinka's resilience and refusal to back down from speaking truth to power has sometimes intimidated those comforted by the status quo. In various voices, through cultural practices and political activism, Professor Soyinka has sought to summon a collective will that enables the ideas of constant becoming and vigilance against tyranny. Those familiar with his autobiographies know the speaker's notoriety for coining names for people. Some of us, his former students, and I dare say I betrayed the confidence of my cohort, did the same for him. We would call him, unbeknownst to most, we would call him the paradigm. Indifference, of course, and we will mark his coming and going as paradigm on location, paradigm lost, paradigm regained, and for us, he was and remains a consistent moral and political compass. As artists under his tutelage, we learned to transcend traditional disciplinary boundaries. I recall a class on aesthetics I took with Professor Soyinka some 35 years ago. There, intriguing ideas of time, place, spirituality, the sublime, abstraction, contemplation, and purpose provoked us, and to this day informs the foundation of my scholarship and artistry as I teach in an art school at New York University. The exhibition Wole Soyinka, Antiquities Across Times and Place at the Ethelbert Cooper Gallery is a continuation of that class, as a matter of fact, and conversations we've had over time. I have been privileged to be his stage manager, apprentice, assistant, student at various times, and it's just with unbelievable gratitude that I thank you, Professor Gates, and the Hutchins Center for giving us the opportunity once again to share with the world our mentor, you and I, our teacher. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is with great gratitude that I present to you my teacher, Professor Wole Soyinka.
Thank you very much. It's always good, very good feeling to be back in this hall. And so we'll go ahead with this excursion for the first time, I think, in the United States that I've undergone this kind of experience. Else, for some reason, I had to check, in fact, from Matt, say, wait a minute, it occurs to me that I never really have embarked on the subject of aesthetics in the States. Isn't that strange? And Skip confirmed it yesterday. That's for some reason this, not surprisingly, this unesthetic city, from the temperature at least, probably just didn't call for the subject. Anyway, here we go. The exhibition at the Cooper Gallery, Hawkins, will serve us as both a background and as a takeoff pad for this lecture triad, but I guarantee that you need not have visited nor even heard about the exhibition. If you haven't, perhaps the talks will nudge you, your curiosity in that direction. If not, I assure you equally, it will not matter in the least. Since there's no possibility, anyway, of having a curator mount the two absent figures whom I shall now co-opt as my entry point, the same leave of absence, I think, can be granted to the transient occupants of the Cooper Gallery. So let's invite in, very briefly, a representative pair of contrasting cultural environments who will lead us into the eternally contentious concept of beauty. Excessive solemnity in the arts tends to pretentiousness, and there we will risk provoking the ire of those Yoruba deities issue, especially who frown on divine afflatus and respond with appropriate deflatus to the pompous and dogmatic, the latter especially, the dogmatic. More importantly, however, our selected entry point enables me to introduce a number of themes that will hopefully preoccupy us during this discourse. So, without further preliminaries, let's begin. We shall step into a gondola in that city that the entire world acknowledges as the heart of beauty at its most sublime in both landscape and structural elegance, that city of 100,000 canals, Venice. Our two contrasting figures, our protagonists, will launch our voyage raising those familiar issues of culture and nurture, inculcation and acculturation, familiarity and strangeness, history and contemporaneity, originality and tradition as often complicating issues in any discourse on aesthetics. It would be near impossible to imagine a more incongruous pairing, either as representatives of their own cultures, their cultural upbringing, or indeed as unique beings in themselves, stamped within their own cultural environment. I've deliberately opted for extremes. We shall begin with the Venetian American, a socialite heiress and patron of the arts, a lady called Peggy Guggenheim, in an encounter courtesy of two famous poets, the Britisher Stephen Spender and W.H. Auden, who was an Anglo-American. The female anatomy as artistic obsession has ever been with us from time immemorial and in all cultures, with the male holding its own near exceptionally in Greek and Roman statuary. Now, here is W.H. Auden addressing this speaker. As a young man, he was then venturing into not just an alien environment, culturally and physically, but also a suspect social class. Now, that did not mean that he was not reveling in the company of these two luminaries of the British literary establishment and the aristocracy that clearly felt honored to cultivate their company. Very much the contrary. In any case, he was fully drawn to the artworks that were liberally spread around the Guggenheim garden and the interior of her palazzo, and which she threw open to the public on certain days of the week. So now, very briefly, here's that young man, his own account from his memoirs, You Must Set Forth at Dawn. I quote, "They, that is, those two, Auden and Spender, took me in tow, unveiling surprises or simply manifestations of the local culture, including a glass factory where I bought a delicate, spiral-lined decorative flask that has unbelievably survived all displacements till this day. Opera was predictably on the menu, heard from the heiress's own personally subscribed box. However, and here again I quote, W.H. Auden persisted in distracting me from feasting my eyes on her collection, saying things like, don't miss it when she turns her ass, dear boy. She's sliced it off surgically, flattened it, so she could wear those Charleston dresses of the swinging 20s. Next, we shall make a drastic transfer to a famous Nigerian fixture who happens to have ruled my nation twice, once as a military dictator, and next as elected civilian president. If we must select a voice of down-to-earth African aesthetics, both his admirers and detractors will agree that you could not find a more unapologetic promoter of African aesthetic. If I fail to quote him verbatim, please understand that it is only because it would have taken too much time to wade yet again through his 3-volume tract of memoirs to find the exact quote. But I guarantee you that he is not misrepresented. But first, let our own media, the media report on the recent 40th anniversary celebration of the 1977 World Festival of Black Cultures, FESTAC, serve as his cultural credentials. Our protagonist is reported as saying during this festivity just a few weeks ago, we celebrated FESTAC to show the world that Black and African peoples have culture. And what is the meaning of culture? It is the totality of the way of our people, their food, their dances, songs, the ways they marry, the way they bury their dead. Culture is the totality of the way of life of any people. No contest. Now, to his views on beauty, extracted from his memoirs. On a training course in the UK, our deep-dyed indigene of the Yoruba kingdom of Owu, near my own hometown, Abeokuta, narrates how he and his course mates would sometimes assess the women who came into their orbit. One day, one of his roommates began enthusing over a woman he had met, rhapsodizing over her legs. This a man found amazing, eventually becoming irritated. He burst out in more or less the following words. I looked at the man and said, is this man crazy? What has a woman's legs got to do with beauty? Who's got any interest in looking at a woman's legs? Now, it's not his exact words, I admit, but I assure you it's accurately his sentiment. And let me admit it, just to reassure us here, especially my fellow Nigerians who sprinkle all over here, that no malice is intended in co-opting him as reference point. As a student in the UK, I also marveled at as I listened to my British classmates swoon over female legs. It sounded like some willed fetishism. It began to prey on my mind to such an extent that I sometimes missed parts of the seminar exchanges. I was too preoccupied with anatomizing the legs of our female companions, crossing and uncrossing, while I was supposed to be anatomizing the mind of Goneril through the eyes of King Lear. Later, of course, you could claim that I also came to appreciate some truly elegant legs, but the idea of taking them as in isolation as compelling beauty points remained strange to me for a very long time. Just to remind us that the picture is not limited to Britain, to the English or European and their lines of colonial indoctrination, we may wish to take in the Chinese somewhere along the way. The Chinese and Japanese also inflicted the most horrendous pain on their womanhood through the notion that small is beautiful. The procedure for binding the feet of the female child from near infancy and then forcing them to adopt a highly admired, in Japan, mincing walk, and the pain involved qualifies those ages to be tried retroactively at The Hague for cruelty against the girl child. So now, let's call in the traditional Yoruba artist for an opinion. For him, the prime anatomical value is placed on other parts, the buttocks and the breasts. And these artists will assure you that fertility itself, not just the physical parts, is primary to the very concept of female beauty. Arms and legs may be foreshortened or even compacted out of existence. Even the head and jaws sometimes unrealistically elongated, leaving the woman with that notorious prognathous appearance. The feet splayed out of proportion, what we used to deride as children as no size in London, usually crudely demarcated in 5 discernible digits. Those two parts, however, head and buttocks, associated with birth and child, the latter providing, that is the buttocks, providing a comfortable and secure saddle for the child when traditionally swung sideways and then rearwards to be secured by a sash, are given special attention. In general, the prominence of fertility figures and associated objects in much of Yoruba and some other African traditional statuary completes the picture. African music video industry today has merely continued and expanded a tradition established in the majority of African dances across the continent. A resource that was first catapulted, I think, onto the international stage by that maverick musician, Fela Anikulapo Kuti. For him and his queens, dance began and ended with the exhortation to shake that nyash. To return, however, to our traditional carver, for the last word. Procreation was the ultimate decider. The representation, the representative symbols, giving rise to the vast array of stylistic expressions. In short, celebration of that part of the anatomy. Let me also reaffirm the foregoing with a quotation from a Nigerian curator, her name Umebe Onyejekwe. In her notes on the first public exhibition from my collection, against more of that in a short while, she wrote, "Another thing highly treasured by the African is birth. The birth of a child is a significant occasion that concerns both the living and the dead. Inability to have a child is a matter of grave concern, not only to the couple, but also to their entire relatives, clan, village, and the dead. It's a matter that concerns the dead more than the living. To ensure fertility of both humans and food crops, the artist went to extremes to do justice to this aspect of their religion and life by producing fertility objects. Prayers and libations are offered, and all manner of works of art are used to make the prayer effective." I try to imagine that African traditional carver at a fashion parade in Paris or London or New York, confronted by those anorexic models with straggly legs and jutting bones as the ideal concept of beauty and elegance. The scandalized soul will rush back to his village to commence rites of purification and pacification for a plague that has descended all over Europe. That pursuit, procreation as the main ethos of human existence, sustaining and enhancing that existence, informs even the art of the miniature, most especially the Ibeji, whose representation in numbers I especially requested the curator to please accommodate in the Hutchins exhibition. You might want to see them scattered all over the place. I made the same intervention with regards to Ifa, the agency of divination presided over by Orunmila, god of wisdom, since this is the first and ultimate destination of the Yoruba to which the suppliant resorts in his or her quest for an explication of and or intervention in mundane existence, of which the primacy is continuity. A preoccupation with not breaking the chain that forms the collective universe of the Yoruba, which is the universe of the dead, the living, and the unborn. In that respect, we see that an immense burden, perhaps unfair, is placed on the woman as sustainers of that meaning and justification of human existence. Yoruba iconography is captured in the proliferation of those three motifs: the mother, the Ibeji, that is the twins, and the Ifa. They strike me as containing the thematic trilogy of the carver's art. If I sought to make a correlation between this representational trilogy and the other, that is the trilogy of the Yoruba worldview, which I've just cited, in totality, I would propose that the mother stands for the living, or simply life, the child for the unborn, and Ifa for the ancestor, which of course merely imposes my own correlation tendencies, no suggestion at all as to whether this also formed the traditional artist's manifesto. One might even claim, with only a minor exaggeration, that other art motifs are merely variations on this trilogy, in part and in combination. Certainly, a study of the art of the votive figures, of caryatids, house posts, and even representations of deities often suggest a constant opportunism. Insert those symbols whenever and wherever you can. Let me remark also that one hardly encounters the carving of a child in isolation, of one child, extremely rare indeed. The Ibeji, the twins, is the artistic shorthand for this fertility concept. Its proliferation expresses supplication, fulfillment, and celebration at one and the same time. In an introduction to a prior exhibition, which I termed the cogency of the miniature in Yoruba art, in yet another mini exhibition, this was at the Freedom Park in Lagos some years ago, I wrote, "The art of the Ibeji, the twin, which forms the core of this selection, is autogenous, by which I mean it is self-enclosed as a unique genre, obliged only to its own formalism, but with a million variations in the relativities of anatomical parts and their adornments. Within the marriage of form and scale, frozen through time, is also embedded and evoked among the knowledgeable the entire mythography of the Ibeji, from birth to death, through community rites for earthing such a temperamental entity, rituals of appeasement that link the Ibeji to the Abiku. Abiku, in turn, Abiku is the child that dies, is reborn, dies and is again reborn. Hence the paradoxical agedness that is the mark of these problematic infants, full sprung, as it were, from the troubled womb, wise often beyond their calendar age. Do keep in mind this mystery of the child called Abiku. We shall encounter it yet again in our exploration of the nature of Yoruba art and art in general. For now, however, acknowledging that these series are taking place against the background of an exposition, and thus the collector himself becomes part of the objects of curiosity, let us devote some minutes to the phenomenon of that victim of the acquisitive lust known as the collector. It's time to approach the confessional. Thus, let it be known right away that far-fetched and unlikely as it might seem, but nonetheless factual, I'm not a great enthusiast for exhibiting works from my collection. Despite this admission, however, it's true that I have considered three altogether, three main ones, one in Oviedo, Spain, in fact, maybe 3.5, if I count another one. This, in effect, would be the 4.5. It's just the kind of contradiction that art engenders in the collector, I suspect. The hidden but base thematic context, after all, is the collector himself. And while a curator enters the fray with his or her own thematic incline, the base material remains product of the collector, his adventures, motivations, the harvest of his judgment, whims and incidental encounters, and even occasionally gifts. Here is one of them on that side. We'll come to it in a moment. I do not speak, of course, of the special breed of monothematic, those item-fixated collectors, like those who collect matchboxes and things like that, where the factor of aesthetics plays a minor, if any role at all. Ultimately, the reality is that one does not collect artworks for others, but for oneself. In addition, impulses are as different individually as each individual piece from another in a collection. For some, it doesn't go beyond commercial purposes, calculations, especially where works of art can appreciate astronomically. In the United Kingdom, for example, death duties are known to stimulate the collector's avidity. A collection, the kind of which I have come to recognize that I indulge in, is a kind of private extension of the self. And there do exist individuals who are loath to invite strangers into the home. So the thought of actually taking bits and pieces of such an internalized home, perpetually under construction, renovation, recognition, reconciliation, was simply not a notion that ever emanated from me. The circumstances that broke down that barrier are part of the very story of our objects on display. It came about through the persistence of that earlier mentioned Umebe Unyejekwe, interestingly a non-Yoruba, newly posted to my hometown, my home state, Ogun, some 25 years ago. She was a compact, feisty Igbo lady who obviously both knew and loved her profession, and she could not resist the possibility of interjecting a new consciousness into the public cultural life of her new community. The winning stroke was when she offered to identify, catalog, and label all the items in the house so they could be easily identified and advertised if I suffered any more robberies, a few of which I already had under my belt, some with quite devastating effect on my psyche. We shall come to one of the most important of these before we are done. We are, after all, embarked on a voyage of artistic lust, no other word for it. Lust gratification in all its ramifications, criminalities included. As usual, other factors intruded in her favor, including her accidental meeting with one of my young informal proteges who was just getting a foothold into the business world. It was all very remarkable, the coincidence of timing. And here was the irony. At that very time, I already had my acquisitive mind on a family shrine at Ile-Ife, that cradle of the Yoruba world. And it was this young entrepreneur who brought it to my attention. The priestess of that shrine was, in fact, his own grandmother, and the cornering of whose items I had reserved my next foray. Buffeted by their enthusiasm, I began to lose some of the sharp edges of my extended family protectionist instinct. I shall quote him in a moment. His comments serve to remind us that African traditional worship and its symbolic precipitates that we consider divine works of art were companions of quotidian life among the Yoruba and also much of African society. They were domestic dwellers. Also, since the theme of collection, the theme of collectors, I beg your pardon, which will constitute a thread running right through our discourse, this episode does serve as a foretaste of what even I confess to be a kind of possession. But the setting described here is what I truly wish to impress on our minds. It replicates in near detail, for instance, the environment of my own grandfather's home in Ishara. That's different from Abeokuta, my maternal home, and some other homes to which he religiously dragged all of us, we aliens, from a Christian home in Abeokuta to taste of some traditional material, me in particular. I think he already fingered me as the heathen among the lot. Our sponsor wrote as follows, I quote, Shagore Wokbu, I think that's the pronunciation, my late grandmother was a chief priestess of that Shango shrine situated in my late grandfather's courtyard, which itself stood symbolically adjacent to the well, the only source of drinkable water for the entire members of the family and the head's large area of authority. I speak of the family of the great hunter himself, Baba Tani Iwara, whose area of jurisdiction in Ogbinigbi compound in the ancient city of Ile-Ife, the source itself. End of quote. Akitilo, that's the name of this the entrepreneur, goes on to describe the responses of a young mind to this ambience of Yoruba spirituality. It's a very common one, which is why I quote it. To an impressionable young mind, the only striking thing was the collective mythical aura contained in those objects in the shrines, the artifacts, idols. I hate that word, but anyway, I'm quoting him verbatim. Idols, products from iron in their raw and natural state, boldly suggesting the effervescent presence of even Ogun, the destroyer and creative genius, all rolled in one. End of quote. And so on, until much later, in the early 1970s, he then continues, in later years, it was on my first visit to the house of Professor Soyinka at the University of Ife that I came across anything so close to the Shango shrine as Baba Atani Iwara. The fear, the myth about the powers of these gods that were always present in my dreams as life idols were gone by now, but I still marvel at the ability of the cohabiter of that shrine, Professor Soyinka, to live with the objects. I concluded, and who would not, he writes, that he must be an Abamieda, meaning a weird being. All right, so far, so funny. However, what followed was not so funny. Akintilo invited me to visit the shrine, assess and feel free to take away any items that I felt would fit into my shrine. I quote, "We were to go back to my grandmother's shrine after her demise to retrieve some of these objects. When, 2 weeks to the appointed date, I got a message that some curator from out of space had come to empty the entire shrine. Of course, after I heard the news, I called Professor Soyinka. His remarks were expectedly unprintable here and now." Unprintable? Akintilo did not know the half of it, nor does he even till this day. He will after this. He will know what efforts I made to hunt down the mysterious raiders, the curators, so-called, who thereafter vanished into thin air. In my mind, that shrine already belonged to me. That was an entire domestic and authentic shrine with all its ambience, the custodianship of which had been transferred to me, I insisted. I already envisaged its repatriation to my own living space. I was ready to dig a well, identical to the one at Ogminigbo compound, and even find a Shango initiate to administer that entity. I was already tasting the ambience of that shrine. It was a painful experience, and I felt divinely punished for allowing 2 weeks before the visit. The excitement building up with me every day, instead of bundling Akintilo straight into my Jeep and driving straight to that shrine. As I fully expected, no record of the takeover of that shrine and its evacuated objects has appeared in the National Museum. Not a trace of a single one of its contents at Ife Museum within the same ancient city. Akintilo has yet to be notified formally of the acquisition. I still feel that even then I should have summoned my hunting group and Ogun sniffer dogs, embarked on an instant hot pursuit, tracked them down, brained any captive with a Shango axe, impaled him on a staff of Orishauko, dismembered him with Ogun machete, then served his remains on an Ifa tray and left the pieces at the crossroads for Eshu. Well, that was then. For solace, even at the thought of that loss from this distance, let me transport us across the world to Asia, to South Korea, where, again, one of those remarkable coincidences, I actually found myself yet again just a fortnight ago. I never cease to marvel at how the aesthetic muse moves in mysterious ways its wonders to perform. Christians, please don't excuse our borrowing, no offense intended. I assure you, it was in that same Guangzhou, during a PEN international conference, that I first articulated what I can truthfully describe as my earliest recollected instance of aesthetic consciousness in a paper entitled The Magic Lantern. had a somewhat different lecture prepared when I was honored with a private viewing of a new wing of the City Museum, not yet open to the public. It housed some artifacts, some archaeological finds from the Silla dynasty, just being sorted and catalogued. That conference was my third visit to South Korea. I hope I'm counting correctly. During the first, I'd learned of the affinity between Korea and the Black continent through the bane of colonialism, the brutal suppression of our culture under Japanese imperialism, the effort to totally eradicate the Korean distinct identity, so reminiscent of what happened to African peoples under European colonialism and Arab colonialism. It was inevitable during the next visit that I could not resist the urge to acquire one of the excavated pieces from that ancient culture, a stone mug, or shall we simply say a stone clay mug. There it is on that side. Counting that acquisition, the one you see there, was my fourth truly valuable piece of aesthetic catch from foreign encounters. The first was the aforementioned Venetian flask, which I couldn't afford, but I bought it anyway. The second was a pre-Columbian piece from Mexico, bought from a New York store. Third was a Japanese samurai sword, interestingly enough, considering its relationship to, its cruel relationship to Korea. But at that time, I really hadn't known the depth, the extent of the Korean suppression. In fact, my favorite exercise, relaxation, in my forested home was to go into the woods, lay a cheroot on a log of wood, and then uttering a horrendous yell, samurai style, slash down on the cheroot in pieces, bits and pieces. I don't jog, but I do other exercises, like this one, like this one. And with each stroke, pronouncing the name of some local villain until I chopped that cheroot into small pieces. Hardly ever missed once I got into practice. And this last one was this Silan, almost like a subconscious compensation for having bought the Japanese samurai sword. And it is this Silla mug that had the honor of triggering off that vexed issue of beauty versus antiquities. Beauty as an intrinsic element in antiquities and all the other forms of contradiction which we encounter in complementary relationship and sometimes in totally hostile and unsustainable relationship. Now, when I was given that private tour of the museum, it was a very different kind of material in there, all gold and precious stones. Very attractive, but it just did not have, for me, the same value as that mug. Mind you, I'd also visited Lima, Peru, the land that gave birth to the mystery of El Dorado and brought in the Spanish, the bloodthirsty Spanish conquistadors. It's one of the reasons, in fact, why I was pushed to buy that pre-Columbian piece from a New York store. Just, again, sort of empathy instinct, one colonial to another. In that museum, of course, bulletproof, bomb-proof glass doors, steel, stainless glass viewing doors, and we divided into small groups. I went as a tourist, divided into small group, and as each group went, those heavy doors shut behind you, and nobody else was admitted until you had been ushered out through another. It was remarkable, but very instructive, very attractive, but somehow it didn't hold the same fascination for me as that the Silla mug. Acquiring it was itself a thing of a bit of a dubious adventure. And all I'll admit at this point was that when I became obsessed with just taking some souvenir in the form of an antiquity from Silla, I mentioned it to a colleague of mine with whom we used to hold international theater workshops in Paris and all over the place. It was a Korean. And when we went to his store, he brought out from under rags the usual stuff. And I picked one of them, and we began haggling, to which I'd gone rather adept as a result of dealing with Nigerian and Senegalese dealers, very tough customers. And so as we approached the point of payment, I turned to him and said, listen, in my bones, I feel that this is genuine stuff. You hold the material, watch the seriations there, and you just knew that this was a correct item. I said, how am I going to get it out? These new digs are taking place. I know that new laws are being passed. So suppose I'm stopped, come a grave robber and be locked up there. I don't like the idea. The dealer brought out certificate, authentication also, plus an export permit. I said, did he know I was coming here? And he had an export permit ready, stamped, very official, impressive looking. I said, I'm a bit worried. She said, what are you worried about? I'm coming with you to the airport. I assure you that we'll get it out quite legitimately. So I said, but I don't like this certificate. I said, now that. I said, I don't know how to translate it, but don't worry, it's what we call an authentic fake. He said, authentic? I said, yes. Just like many of the items here. He said, but you're right, this one is original. And it was a familiar expression, which I got at once. It was the kind of expression I often got from my Monsieur Touré, my dealer from along the West Coast, originally from Senegal. He would say, okay, why now? Why are you bothering this? I brought it for you special from Bamako. It's a fake original. A fake original. Don't worry about anything. It's a common language across cultures, and it's become meat and drink to any kind of collector. And it always raises in me the question, why does one then bother to collect? Why does one go after antiquities when you know very well that some of them can be original fakes, authentic fakes? What is it about them? It's very difficult. It's something which I've never really solved, and therefore I go round and look at some of the motivations for some of the items which I collected, like these ones, which came through an attraction of historic empathy between one colonial and another. That's not the dominating factor. Let me not exaggerate. We'll come to the others. But I'm saying that when one looks at motivations, it's possible to build up a kind of, shall we say, collector aura, of a mixture of, acquisitiveness, just wanting to own, probably the 10th deadly sin, I have no idea. But other people collect, for instance, for educational purposes, material for teaching. Some of that, you could say, is part of my motivation. But if you really want to know somebody who collects for education, you must go to a compatriot of mine called Remy Chillon. And compared to my collection, his is like a universal warehouse. And students come from all over the world, especially from the United States, to study African antiquities, art styles, etc., etc. And he even commissions artists to do not only modern works of their own, but actually to copy others to provide material for teaching. So you could say he's a real proprietor of original fakes in his own right, in addition to, of course, having some really stunning, unbelievable traditional works there. And including even Egungun, not just Egungun masks, which have been used as divine objects in divine ceremonies, but actually engages both carvers and tailors and so on to make complete Egungun costume, all representing different styles and different units within even ethnic groups. There is also the high priest, Egbohon, I thought I would introduce some of them to you, of Benin. His compound in Benin is a shrine of many splendid and multi-thematic rooms. I believe that the high priest also visits a university here from time to time. I think it's in Fort Lauderdale, where he lectures. He's written books, and so he teaches. He's a prolific author, versed in many aspects of Benin history, tradition, and religious practices. I believe he sometimes even comes here with performance troupes. Himself, of course, is a first-class performer. Don't let him tell you about the health benefits of elephant's vomit. You will turn green, and not with envy, I assure you. So teaching, yes, this is also part of the story, the joy of sharing knowledge, but not sharing the material. It does come into it, but it doesn't really penetrate through to the base psyche of the collector. Shall we simply rest our curiosity on the mountain climber's solution? You know, why do you climb mountains? And the answer is because the mountain is there. I don't care. Crazy people, all those examples, collecting is much safer most of the time. But while we ponder the mountain climber's formula as being applicable or not to the collector, I collect because Shangore Wapo Shrine is there. We shall return to our main subject, which is actually the issue of aesthetics, of which collection and its value complications remains an intriguing, indeed nagging puzzle, which is why I've asked for those two to be placed together. This elegant-looking pot, for instance, you'd be astonished how much it costs. It's a gift. It's a Chinese teapot made by one of the greatest, considered one of the greatest potters in China, and from clay, which is found apparently in only one area of China. And that inscription, part of it means the international school that is authenticated by them. And then his name is, I'm afraid, doesn't appear there. I intend to find a Chinese expert while I'm here, by the way, to see if he can actually get the name. Everything was given to me, but of course, I'm not a very good record keeper. And when I look at those two, I ask myself, well, on the surface of it, one is clearly a work of elegance. It's smooth. There's a kind of symmetry about it. It looks it doesn't look as if it should be used for tea. It's more as if it's something you keep and you caress and so on. The other one is rough and ready, chipped. And ask myself, what is it? If you ask me to pick out of those two, you came with me, and I knew the history of that, the circumstances, I would pick that. This has its uses also. It's a teapot, but I use it for sake, warm sake in my house. I think it belongs to that. But that particular kind of pot is so valued by the Chinese, and the history of that particular pot is so remarkable. I can't remember the figure, about 4 or 6 were made by this genius. And they were given to some very high up people in the hierarchy. And this one actually was designated for one of them, who, however, fell out of favor during one of the purges, the power struggles in the party. And so this had been sitting there while they were wondering who they could give it to without incurring the political ire of the hierarchy, and also without wasting it. So I was lucky. I just came along at the right time, and suddenly somebody got the idea. So yes, this is our visitor. Let him have that missing one. And the head of the Chinese School of Writers there, whose guest I was, he has one beautiful writer's retreat. He carries his pot around in a bag slung over the shoulder. wrapped in, made a special bag for it so that it wouldn't chip or anything, and uses this pot for his tea. So wherever he goes, he asks for hot water and brings out this special pouch of tea, which incidentally reinforces itself. After, you can keep just, with this pot, you can keep putting hot water onto that tea. And apparently the infusion just continues. Just like my ogogoro bottle in Abeokuta, in which the herbs go in the ogogoro, the gin. And it doesn't matter how often you replenish it, it still comes out tasting exactly the same. So that's one of the reasons I thought, well, let him join with sake by the ogogoro. They make a very interesting pair. Now, talking of this collection, we now move to the sociology of collection, some of the hidden reasons why collections take place. And we're talking in individual, personal terms. Each one is different. And one of the greatest losses which I endured, a very deep, demoralizing loss in this collection, took place when I was at the University of Ife some 30 years ago. Visitors to my home, the first, that is, when I was in Ife, it was a bungalow, may remember the carvings which welcomed them to the house. The same thing to my house in Ibadan. There were two on either side of the door. One was a monkey, the other a caryatid, a female caryatid. That monkey had one of the most impressive fallacies I've ever seen on any carving in the world. It was unique. And in addition, the carver had given the monkey a gesture of pain, of lament, like that. Now, look what I'm burdened with. His hand, his mouth. I have no picture of it there were pictures at the time, but unfortunately I've undergone some raids, which we won't go into about, especially on the Abacha, where I lost a number of documentation and so on. So I can't even give you a picture of that pair. On the other side of the door was a caryatid, as I said, which had suffered from the vagaries of nature, and it was split from the navel down across the vulva, completely split. So I put them on either side of the door to create what I called a field of force. And I promised anybody who passed through that field that they would be endowed with many supernatural powers and so on and so forth. That monkey, it really was remarkable. I mean, the phallus and Roman carving, Roman sculptures, and marble sculptures, a wimp beside this monkey's phallus. It was re-echoed for me very recently in South Africa by that painter whose work created such a furore. It was a painting of the president with something similar endowment, entitled "The Spear of Africa," which is a mockery of the movement, the military movement, the Spear of Africa. It was made after his escapade, accusation of rape, which seems to be getting quite some attention here these days. And when he said that after this alleged, but for him consensual rape, of a woman who said she was suffering from AIDS, he had a shower and that took care of it. So this was a comment on that episode. He didn't like it and he went to court, thank goodness, instead of going after him with a spear. The painting also, I'm convinced, by the way, that South African artist stole my monkey, or else bought it from one of the dealers and has been making variations of it to deal with his political opponent. Very similar again to the picture, the photograph, which was by Mapplethorpe, which was at the Hutchins Center for quite some time, with this black person, complete suit, and with the Spear of America protruding through his fly. And it was hated. This coupling was hated by a certain extreme group on campus in Nigeria who protested so much when I was in Ibadan that I had to take it off, transfer it to my garage, which I turned into my study. So at least nobody could come and challenge me there. I would spare him with the spare of Africa. Now, when I was in Ife, I transferred this pair to my home, and there it stood for some time. It was ponderous, both were waist high, and so this put me in a complacent state that nobody will, the cost and effect of stealing those two, the labor of sneaking in and going off with them was just too much. So I didn't chain them down, I just left them outside until a midnight visit when the two disappeared. Now, I should, at this point, introduce you to the sociology of campus at that particular time. A culture of religious fundamentalism and puritanic affectations had commenced and was beginning to spread from one university campus to the next. It had developed into a raging epidemic by the time I moved to Ife. The so-called born-again Christian phenomenon was taking its toll on both faculty and student bodies, turning campuses into one vast revivalist arena, with so many sects speaking in tongues that anyone passing would have imagined that nothing but languages, ancient and arcane languages, were being taught at the University of Ife. Both Islam and Christians were at each other full-throated, each group yodeling at each other in and out of prayer hours, but both united in ideas of what was righteously permissible and what was not, especially when the impropriety emanated from so-called pagan beliefs and objects. Needless to say, this speaker, for many of them, was the ultimate devil incarnate, and the complaints had been going on about these two objects there. And so, finally, one night, they disappeared. It was so shocking, the attitudes which were involved tangentially with this revivalist instinct of both religions. And so my collection, the intensification of my collection was not unrelated to the sociology that was rampaging through the campuses at the time. It was so bad that it affected government policies and even the bureaucracy, which was supposed to be neutral in executing the policies of what was supposed to be a secular, or at least a multi-religious nation. At the time, such extremism was limited to assault on works of art, wherever possible, and manifestations such as traditional dances, egungun parades to the hands, which some people said offended Christian and Islamic sensibilities. It was necessary to apologize in advance. Some of them even said before the egungun, the ancestral masquerade, was allowed. And even in the quotation which I made just now from a former twice president of the nation, there was always that apologetic note, the tone. The title, in fact, of that clipping, that particular reportage was, Festac was not about fetishism. People felt they had to apologize, even for any traditional manifestation, including the World Festival of Black and Negro Art. And so, the intensification of our collection was also part of a vengeance on this extremism. Those of you who've been to Ibadan, may remember the effort to establish a place of worship for traditional religions called Orule Orisha, which is roof of the deities. Everything went smoothly. Land was allocated. Designs had been made for a sort of ecumenical space for traditional worship of the various deities. Even some prayer meetings had been begun, ministered by the Araba, that's the Prince of Ifa, of Ile-Ife itself. And suddenly, after a change of guard, somehow the license for the land was withdrawn, a new space was created supposedly for all religions to move. It was all a lie. This whole elaborate charade was just to make sure that traditional worship did not take place on campus. Let me remind you once again that those two symbolic, pieces were not miniatures. They were large-size objects. Until today, there's been no sighting, despite my setting my dealers on the track of them. Photographs were sent out, not one reported sighting. Some auto da fe had taken place, evidently, not too far from the place of pilfering. And so, when we look at objects also in these intimate circumstances, the sociology of the environment is very relative. Taken from the beginning, the escalation of intolerance, of rejectionism, of demonization, which was begun by the missionaries, escalated in this modern day and age. This was what led, eventually, this at least encouraged, it laid the ground, the permissive grounds, for phenomena like Boko Haram. And in between one religious-inspired robbery, at least speculatively religious-inspired, but I'm convinced that it was, then you had the whaling of motor vehicles, beer delivery vehicles in states like Kwara, supposed to be multi-region, whaling, lynching of drivers, moving on to assault on the capital of Nigeria itself, Abuja, over a beauty pageant, because some Islamic religionists felt that this was against their religious sensibility and it should not take place. It cost about 350 lives in the capital city to prove their point. And many people do not understand the beginnings of intolerance that leads to outright homicidal mayhem, beginning with that level of rejection of the symbols even, and the destruction of the symbols, just like the old missionary evangelists in earlier, even immediate pre-colonial times. And so, when these various acts of disdain for the autochthonous religions takes place, one has only one answer: bring on the hidden gods. That's when you become even more tolerant of Monsieur Touré when he arrives at your door, and you say, okay, let's see what's in your bag anyway. It's about time I installed one more representative of the contemned religion in my house. Same level, same wave of intolerance, of aggressive, homicidal intolerance is what we see spreading all around the world today. What is the first act of Ansar Dine in Mali when he moved on to Timbuktu? Destroy all quote-unquote idols, all fetishes, including, of course, writings, the literature, the poetry, the manuscripts, treasured manuscripts, housed in various libraries, so that they have to be saved at the cost of enormous risk by fidelists of learning and religion. It's the same principle of intolerance which we see on the African continent, which is manifested all over the globe. What is it that annoys one, that irritates and eventually even alarms one when a mullah from a country called Iran goes to a wine-producing country and says wine must not be served at the banquet which is being given in his honor, as he did in Italy. And Italy succumbed. It's one of the most spineless acts of concession that I've ever witnessed from one nation to another in peacetime without the declaration of war. It was left to poor France to say to the Ayatollah, sorry, the God we worship here is Dionysus. You don't like Dionysus, you go back to where you came from, and saved the honor of we, heathen, Innerfields alliance of the world. And so on so many levels, political and of course aesthetic. Art collection becomes a kind of personal, fossiless, not strident resort. But of course, it doesn't begin there. It doesn't begin there. It begins in that mystery of what we call the aesthetic adventure. But I have to emphasize the fact that basically, in many instances, collection becomes a response, a private response, just to be able to survive the onslaught of the denigration of culture, one's own culture, which is why most of my items are, in fact, African pieces. You do not confer potentiality on objects of art yourself, unlike the artists who did so. But circumstances, political, sociological, and of course, aesthetic, compel us even to extend the real potentiality of artworks. When the Taliban moved into Afghanistan, it was Afghanistan, wasn't it, and spent so much time and energy pulverizing the statue of Buddha, that is when you say to Mr. Toure, the Taliban are here, bring out the Orisha. That's when you run in your head the lines of Birago Diop in Breaths, who writes, hearing more often things than beings, the voice of the fire listening, hear the voice of the water, hear in the wind, the bushes sobbing, it is the sigh of our forebears. Those who are dead are never gone. They are in there, in the thickening shadows. The dead are not under the earth. They are in the tree that rustles. They are in the wood that groans. They are in the water that runs. They are in the water that sleeps. They are in the hut. They are in the crowd. They are not dead. Or you summarize it all in that quiet injunction of your own Yoruba people. Go to the Orisha and be wise. And finally, you call up your dealer to be practical and ask, what have you got in your itinerant pouch? Bring out some solid pagan, African, heathen, unbeliever, irreverent, paradoxically iconoclastic, but life-affirming, funky Orisha, original or fake. I want to re-people the world in my own image. Thank you.